This is Metro Week. Our top story, how does the governor's proposed budget affect the metro area? We'll ask local government leaders what the trickle-down impact is. Then our Journalists Roundtable analyzes the week's news.
Welcome to Metro Week. I'm Andrea Kelly. The governor's proposed spending plan for the next fiscal year is getting attention for what it does and does not include. We're going to find out how it might impact the city of Tucson and Pima County. First, a look at the basics of the budget plan. Each year, the budget negotiations begin with the governor's proposal. Then the Arizona House and Senate will make changes, and all three parties have to agree before it's a final product. Governor Ducey is quick to point out that his proposal for the fiscal year that ends in mid-2017 will eliminate the structural deficit, which is the difference between ongoing revenue and ongoing spending. He says the budget has an extra $100 million for K-12 education. Of that, $15 million is for building repairs, and half is for increased enrollment and inflation. Ducey and the legislature cut almost $100 million from universities this year. He wants to add back $4 million before the end of this fiscal year and another $14 million next fiscal year. He also wants more than $30 million for his new border strike force. For many years, the state has put money from the Highway User Revenue Fund, known as HURF, toward the Department of Public Safety's budget. Local governments scoff at this practice because the funds are supposed to be used on transportation. The practice of transferring money to DPS continues this year. Now, Pima County Administrator Chuck Huckleberry and Tucson City Manager Michael Ortega. They joined me for a discussion of their expectations from the proposed state budget. Let's start with transportation funding. Mr. Ortega, Ducey's budget does not include more funding or giving some of that transportation funding back to the cities and counties. His justification is that if he did so, it would add to the structural deficit for the state. Do you accept that explanation?
Well, certainly understand it. Don't know that I accept it entirely because the reality for us locally is without the HURF monies, without those gas tax dollars, we can't maintain our infrastructure. We can't maintain our pavement. And when you drive around Tucson, you see that it's in need of repair, in need of maintenance. Those dollars have to come from somewhere. And I understand Governor Ducey's thoughts there, but as a local government official who's responsible for the infrastructure here, it makes it very difficult for us to do business when we don't have enough money to pave our roads. And
Mr. Huckleberry, you've been pushing year after year to reverse those shifts. We're not seeing progress.
Transportation funding in Arizona is really at a crisis level. Transportation revenues haven't been increased in 25 years. We're seeing the surrounding states taking action, whether it's giving counties gas tax authority or whether it's raising gas taxes or converting the per gallon tax to a sales tax. We're losing our competitive edge. Our transportation system is what drives economic development and growth, and without funding, we will lose.
You've been pushing over the years lately for an increase in the gas tax to help solve this problem. You're still pushing for that, but the legislature is not inclined to add tax increases. So why are you still pushing?
Well, we're pushing because it's just simply what has to be done. If we think that somehow our transportation system is going to survive in any state of ability to move people, it's not. We've got to basically face the problem head on, and that's come to the grips with the reality. It's going to require a tax increase, whether it's a gas tax or a vehicle license tax or a vehicle mile tax or a sales tax on gasoline. We don't really care. All we know is that transportation revenues are the lowest they've been in 25 years. Fuel efficiency is not helping that. The wear and tear on the roads are pretty self-evident throughout the state, and we need to take some action to actually get the tax base increased for transportation.
Broadening this discussion out a little bit, Mr. Ortega, what's your overall characterization of the impacts the state budget has on the city budget?
Well, the direct impact is minimal in terms of year to year. So the increases that the state has seen in terms of revenues and things that they're dealing with have not impacted us, nor have their shortfalls in this year. But I think that the conversation is broader than that. I think it's really a function of looking at the loss of lottery monies that used to be distributed to the city, look at the transportation dollars that are shifted to Department of Public Safety. I mean, those are the kinds of issues that when the state was in difficult financial times, they took those dollars, they basically reassigned them, they're using them for other purposes. And that's understandable when there's tough times. But if they are now in better times, then they need to restore those and give us back those dollars that we need desperately for our public safety and for our transportation.
And Mr. Huckleberry, your overall characterization of the impacts?
We're a political subdivision of the state, and so it's fairly easy for the state to pick our pockets, and they do that on a regular basis. They did it last year worse than any time they've ever done it. We lost $22 million of money to the state to actually pay for state programs that the county really has nothing to do with. That hasn't eased with this budget. There's been no reduction of the state transfers. Fully 1/3 of our property tax goes to the state, $106 million. The state does basically likes to talk about not having a property tax. Well, they require counties to levy property taxes for them and transfer those monies to the state.
Mr. Ortega, I want to ask you about a specific proposal that the governor has made, and that is that if cities or municipalities institute a minimum wage that's higher than the state minimum wage, they will be deducted some of the state revenue that normally would go to those cities. Is the city of Tucson talking about this kind of a scenario, or are you talking about minimum wage changes here?
Well, I can tell you that formally the council has not discussed that. That is not something that the Tucson City Council has addressed formally. And I know there are other cities in the state that have and that are in that discussion. But let's take a step back. I think the bigger question is whether or not the state government can, in essence, tell us we can't do something when we're a charter city, when the governance is that of the people that are in this community. And so that's the conversation I think that we've had concern over. And we'll see how that plays out. I know that other cities in the state are looking at that. And so we'll watch that very closely in terms of the reaction that the state has to some of those proposals.
How do you read that proposal that the governor made, or suggestion, or threat, as others are calling it, in the context of the city's present conversation about potentially requiring mandatory sick leave at employers?
Well, certainly that'll have to be factored in. The council has asked me to look at that concept of paid sick leave, and we are doing that. We have a focus group that's looking at that has stakeholders. But clearly one of the pieces of that, should the council decide they want to pursue that, would need to be, how does this potentially impact, or will it be impacted by the states? And I'll use the word threat. And it's difficult to know exactly, because I think it'll ultimately probably play out in the courts.
I want to shift to public safety. One of the bigger issues in the city budget is the pensions for public safety employees, and those are through the state system. So anytime things change with the formula of how those are paid, it's out of your hands. And I understand the sheriff's deputies, retirees, are in the same system. It's been an issue for the city budget. What are your options? Can you go to the legislature and try to change that formula?
Well, certainly there's a lot of conversation, and I think it's important that first and foremost, it is not the employee's fault. It is not the firefighters, not the police officer's fault that this situation exists. It is a structural problem with the way the system was established many years ago, 20-something years ago. And so when you start to look at that, it has to be fixed, if you will, at that level. And I know there's some proposals that are currently surfacing. There's a lot of conversation in the Phoenix area about placing some type of reform on the ballot. But keep in mind that those reforms generally deal with new hires, which will not impact us, or will not positively impact us in the near term. So basically, we're looking at 7 to 12 years before we see a change in the costs associated with those pensions. And that's a difficult conversation for people to understand today, that even if they were approved by the voter, then it won't have necessarily a significant impact, positive impact to us.
Why does this seem to be a bigger conversation about the city budget than the county budget?
Well, I think it's just simply because in the county budget, it's been relatively stable over the years. We're largely dependent on property tax as opposed to an excise tax. County has no sales tax. We simply get state shared revenues. And so our revenue base has been a little more stable than the cities based on the economic conditions. And so I think that's probably a little bit of the difference. Pensions with regard to law enforcement, it's certainly a concern in the county. Its problem is not as acute because of a number of factors, but I think it's something that probably needs to be addressed and probably should be addressed by the legislature. But I think, as Mike has pointed out, it's going to take a number of years to grow out of that because you cannot retroactively change the benefit programs for your existing employees.
Also on the public safety front, the governor's new border safety task force certainly includes Pima County. What impact does that have on the sheriff's department budget?
Probably not much on the sheriff's department. We have a border crimes unit in the sheriff's department, and it does a fine job at doing, I think, what the governor is interested in. I think our concern is that any time that you disproportionately fund a component of the criminal justice system, in this case putting more law enforcement officers, they're going to make arrests, they're going to do what they do, and so that then causes impacts to other parts of the criminal justice system, the county, the courts, the prosecutors, the public defenders, that all have to be paid for locally by local taxpayers. I think another concern is that it appears the governor has funded this border crimes task force by increasing the diversion out of the Highway User Revenue Fund to fund the Department of Public Safety.
That's what you see when you look at the numbers?
That's what we see when we look at it, and we've been asking the legislature for the last 3 to 4 years to stop the diversion of HERF monies because those monies were intended for streets and highways and road repairs, and that's where they need to stay.
Last question for both of you. What are your options as the legislature now begins negotiating the budget before there's a final package? What can you do to help yourself?
About our only option is one of self-defense, is really trying to minimize the losses that we incur and to try and get some rational public policy discussions going on with regard to the future of Arizona and what we need to do in the area of revenues.
Is that lobbying?
That's lobbying. That's trying to get somebody to finally address transportation revenues in the future, because I think without that, everything else in Arizona is going to fall behind, and we need to take that issue head on. And the only answer is to use the word that's always forbidden to be used, called tax.
And Mr. Ortega, what do you view as the city's options?
Well, clearly, it requires a lot of conversation up north in the Phoenix area at the legislature, our legislators, but it also is a concerted effort on the part of the region, as Chuck mentioned. I think we have to look hard at the entire chemistry of how those funds and that fund, particularly for transportation, works. And those conversations are not necessarily just the lobbyists. That's everyone. That's everyone who's in this region voicing their concerns and making sure that there's clarity there. Now, ultimately, as was mentioned by Chuck, we're in defense mode. It is unfortunate, but oftentimes we talk about our legislative agenda, and the vast majority of the issues are defensive. You know, making sure that state shared revenues aren't cut, making sure that we don't see reductions in some of the formulas that we rely upon, that our residents pay. They pay into those pots of money, and then we receive them back, and that's necessary in order for us to provide the fundamental services that our residents need.
All right, I want to thank you both for coming in today to talk about how the state budget will impact your budgets.
Hi, I'm Lorraine Rivera. Later on Arizona Week, a land rush of sorts in Cochise County. What's behind it all?
We own the ground, so we can keep doing the research. I mean, unless we run out of water, and that's our biggest concern is water. I mean, you don't buy land here, you buy water.
Now our Journalist Roundtable. Joining me in the studio today are David Rupp-Calvis of Tucson Local Media, Christopher Conover, my colleague here at Arizona Public Media, and Patrick McNamara of the Arizona Daily Star. Thanks to each of you for coming in. Patrick, we're going to stay on the topic of HERF funding. You know, it's not getting too much worse for the city and the county, but they also seem to have very little hope that it's going to get better. How much money are they losing to HERF this year? To the sweeps to the Department of Public Safety?
Yeah, I think the county estimates maybe about $3 million less this year, possibly than than last. We won't really know until the final budget's signed, but they certainly have gotten less over the years. I think in 2007, they were at $45 million in HERF funding. Last year, about $40 million. Year before that, $40 million. I think they've been dropped down to as little as $37 million since, I think, the Great Recession time. So there's certainly been challenges for them getting that state funding, and the state sort of adds additional slices to that pie of HERF funding from time to time. So counties have certainly been, and the cities as well, been concerned with that.
And I think we haven't pointed out yet in the show so far that those taxes, so say you buy a gallon of gas in Tucson, that gas tax goes into the state coffers, but the point is it's supposed to come back to the Tucson municipalities because that's where it was paid. That's what we're talking about, the money not coming back to where it's supposed to be.
Yeah, it's been a system that's been in place since 1974. It was to fund local transportation departments, the State Department of Transportation, and some other things. And over the years, the formula fundings have been altered and changed. And at one point, the state used it to balance the budget during the Great Recession. So they took this massive amount from it. It was when these really, what the communities or the municipalities have called sweeps, really started. But they've never really been restored. But it is a per gallon tax on gasoline.
And Christopher, regarding the minimum wage comment that the governor made, is everyone at the legislature on board with that message? Have you been hearing any reaction to it?
Actually, I spoke with the Senate president about it, and he's very much on board with it, but he's looking at even larger issues than the minimum wage. If a city, a municipality, a county does something that the legislature doesn't like, they're going to play with that state shared revenue. It's kind of a carrot and stick. We run into some problems here in southern Arizona with that because Tucson is a charter city. So it's more difficult if the residents of Tucson have voted on something, for example, a minimum wage, and approved it, versus, as Mr. Huckleberry said, the county is a subdivision of the state, so it's much easier for the state to go after that money because a county is a subdivision versus a charter city, which there aren't many of, but Tucson is one of them. But the Senate president brought up the plastic bag issue, which, remember, a couple of years ago, Tucson wanted to ban the use of plastic bags. The legislature passed a bill signed by the governor that said, no, you can't do that. It's that type of thing that they're going to go after.
And we also saw it before with bills from the legislature on how elections should be conducted, which actually ended up in a lawsuit, and the city is still potentially appealing that.
Exactly. So it really is going to become that state shared revenue, a carrot and stick. If the legislature, the governor, doesn't like something a municipality is doing, then they're going to go ahead and threaten. We'll see if they actually do it, and I'm sure it will end up in court no matter what if they do pull that money back.
You've been covering the legislature for many years. You've seen many of these budget cycles where the governor makes a proposal and then the legislature can change it. In the end, they all have to agree. But how likely is it that the legislature, the House and Senate leaders, will make changes to the proposal that Ducey released last week?
The overall budget, they will make changes to. Last year, they were very minor changes. This year, I think we'll see some more changes as opposed to last year. The honeymoon is over a little bit. However, House and Senate leadership are very much in the Ducey camp overall. So they're going to take large portions of what the governor wants to do and go ahead and try and push those through. For example, that state shared revenue issue. The Senate president is very much behind that. So that's a big hammer to push that through.
And David, you have a little more leeway to offer an opinion than some of the others at the table. So I want to ask you about that comment to withhold some state funding if cities pass higher minimum wages than the state. How do you view that comment? Some people are calling it a threat. Michael Ortega said that. Others are just saying it's maybe a warning or a conversation or the opening point of a discussion.
Well, since I have an opinion time, regardless of what you call it, I think it's misguided. I find it somewhat ironic that a governor and the state legislature that cry every time our president tries to do an executive order and tell them what to do are standing up there on the bully pulpit and now telling cities and counties what they have to do. It's very similar things. You know, if Tucson wants to pass a higher minimum wage, then let Tucson pass a higher minimum wage. If it affects the economy in Tucson, then Tucson suffers. You know, the elected officials have made decisions that will impact Tucson. If we want to mandate that every employer in the city of Tucson has paid sick leave, that shouldn't really be a problem with the state. It doesn't impact the state. If it hurts Tucson's economy, it hurts our economy. And we can have those arguments at a different time, whether higher minimum wage and mandated sick leave are good or bad, but I don't think the governor and the state legislature should be telling us we can or can't do things.
Historically, we've seen in this legislature and other legislatures I've covered issues like that, like the sick leave or something like that. The state hasn't wanted to mandate it, but cities and counties will do it, and eventually you get a tipping point where you have more and more municipalities or localities doing it, and the state then jumps on board. So it's kind of a potential change in that dynamic.
That just brings to mind, there's a lot of issues where this has been happening with. Another one is texting while driving, banning that. Tucson has banned it. In effect, because the state has refused to pass a ban on that, despite several lawmakers trying to do that year after year. Steve Farley of Tucson is one of them who really pushes for that every year. He's a senator. State versus local control, what the state can do, what the local will do when the state doesn't move. So it's a repeated theme in Arizona. I'm going to switch topics, though, Patrick, to the county and some county business that happened this week. First, tell us what happened between this lease agreement that the county made with the company called Worldview, a space flight or a space company.
Yeah, it's an economic development deal. County owns this property south of the airport, and they will pay to develop it. They're going to use a financing mechanism called COPS, or Certificates of Participation. And they'll build a manufacturing facility in corporate headquarters. It'll also have this spaceport launch pad site for sort of non-rocket fueled launching, if you will. And the company will lease it over the course of up to, I think, 20 years. County is going to invest about $14.5 million in it. Lease payments will total more than $23 million, with an option at the end to buy for a nominal amount at that point, $10, I think. But the idea is the company would expand into the space. They hope to have, within 5 years, I think, 400 employees. And what they do is they manufacture this capsule and these helium-filled balloons, and they go into a low orbit 20 miles above the Earth, and they bring up scientific payloads, and they'll be doing space tourism for people who can afford the pretty hefty price tag of going. And then it lasts about 5 hours. It ascends and glides sort of gently down up to perhaps 300 miles away to wherever they can direct it to. And that's that's the basics of what's going to happen.
So what's in it for the county? Why is it choosing to sort of have a stake in this company?
Yeah, well, I think they would say first it's not a stake in the company because it would be a violation of a gift clause. They're not investors in the company. But they are developing the property. But it's potentially 400 well-paid jobs, 150% above the regional average, I think, is what it would be. It also is helping to initially develop this aerospace corridor that the county wants to see more of this type of industrial and manufacturing and defense-related industry happening in. And I think the benefit is this larger game of maybe attracting more like companies to come to this region and that specific area.
Does the county seem to see this as the first step in that process that you're describing?
Oh, I think so. It started years before. Raytheon, since at least 2006, has been telling the county that they don't want residential encroachment on their southern border, which was happening. There were several property owners down there that wanted to build some, working class neighborhoods, Don Diamond, one of them, and the county in 2011 then bought some of those properties. Last year they completed realigning that Hughes Access Road about a half mile south, provided that southern border of a buffer zone for Raytheon, and the other areas they want to populate with this type of industrial manufacturing development. So I think it's been a long time coming. It's just been piecemeal, but this is certainly the first tenant of that aerospace parkway for certain.
Okay. And David, we'll talk about the cover story of Inside Tucson Business this week is about all the redevelopment downtown. And one of the sources in your story called it a dramatic change. Can you just sort of run down the indicators that led that person to say that?
It's interesting because the biggest changes downtown started at the same time the economy really, really tanked in all of Tucson. Since 2008, when we were in the middle of the worst recession any of us can remember, there's been 240 new businesses open their doors. almost $500 million in investments. Property values in some places have tripled. You know, if you were renting in 2008, you could get your rental for about $8 a square foot. It's $24 a square foot now. So there's been an enormous interest and an enormous boom downtown. While the rest of the economy has struggled, it's really succeeded down there.
How has the type of development changed over the years since that boom started?
It's been primarily, so far, it's been primarily small mom and pop type places, you know, bars, restaurants, theaters, dance halls, some retail. Over the last year or two, you're starting to see bigger projects take hold. You know, these 240 businesses that came in were mostly small. They would come in and they would spend a couple $1 million to redevelop their location or to purchase it. You know, now we're seeing $100 million up places, you know, larger hotels, whole developments that are going to be almost communities. They're going to have residential and hotels and theaters and museums and retail and shopping all, you know, within a city block. So, I mean, it's kind of moved from real small to growing bigger now.
David, I've heard some complaints from longtime residents, commercial residents in downtown, that all these changes are great for restaurants, bars, nightclubs, stuff like that, but the longer-term residents aren't seeing the return because it's students and a younger demographic coming downtown and not helping them. Did you find any of that?
That's actually true. You know, if you were here 15 years ago renting a place at $8 a square foot and now you're paying $24, the majority of your customers haven't changed. You know, if you were attracted, something where people were coming in and coming down, like the Chicago Music Store for one, they're actually selling their location and moving twofold. Number one, they say right now the real estate market's hot, I can get as much money as ever for my building. But number two, I don't need as much space because my clientele has changed. The people that are living and shopping and working downtown now are much younger. You know, they are students, they are millennials, they're young professionals. So there certainly has been a change, and it hasn't been good for everyone.
Some of your sources also said the music scene drove some of these changes. How much of that is also because of that audience you're describing, the younger?
I think that's a large part of it. You know, the people that are living and working and shopping downtown now are young. You know, they want to be able to go to a nightclub and hear a band play. They want to be able to go out to eat. And what's interesting that I found out is a lot of them have no interest in owning a car. So they want to be able to leave their apartment, walk to some place where they can eat, walk to some place where they can watch a band, maybe go watch a comedy show somewhere, you know, hang out with their friends, and then walk home. You know, they might get on public transportation, they might take Uber, but a lot of them prefer to walk. So they like to have everything within, you know, half mile to a mile of their house.
Patrick, you cover the county, but you also cover transportation. And the other narrative we always hear about downtown is that the streetcar helped drive this revitalization. And also there have been other changes, such as making 6th Avenue two-way downtown. How much have the transportation changes contributed to the overall revitalization?
It probably helped. I mean, there's what's called transit-oriented development. It's, you know, basically an inner city or, you know, congested urban area type of mixed-use development that you'll see areas that are served by public transportation. And I think we're seeing some of that happening with these types of developments that want to be near a public transportation infrastructure. I don't know that they're wedded to a specific mode. A streetcar, for example, you know, buses would suffice as well. And with the streetcar, you know, it would be a lot less expensive if we had buses, of course, but that's not really an option now. But so I think you can say that this development of a transportation network has probably helped. I'm not sure. We reported that it's been maybe somewhat inflated from what the city said. You know, they're including things like the new county service center courthouse building as you know, a streetcar-related development. Well, you know, that was from the 2004 bond package, which was 2 years before the RTA plan package.
And based on court needs, not transportation.
Yeah, it was in the plans for a lot longer than the RTA plan has been in existence. And, you know, some of the other development has been like Rio Nuevo related development, not necessarily, you know, it sort of coincided with, but wasn't the result of, I think.
All right, and speaking of the streetcar, I have to ask you, yes. It's been running for about 18 months now, and you're the transportation reporter, and you just took your first ride. What took you so long?
Well, I wasn't the transportation reporter for almost the first year of operations of the streetcar.
Okay.
It was one.
We'll give you that pass. What about the last few months?
I mean, it's a done deal. You know, I mean, I could have ridden it sooner, but you know, there was other pressing issues to report about: a bond election, the condition of roads that are constantly
Real things.
Yeah, you know, there's potholes everywhere.
Real
Road
news, I
conditions
mean.
are a big deal. So it was not high on the list of priorities.
Again, thanks all of you for coming in, as always. That's our show for this week. We'll take a look at the state education budget in a future episode. In the meantime, catch up with updates on our website. Thanks for watching.